Hello, everyone. I am Andy Werner, and I'm very pleased to present our next speaker, Professor Dr. Francesca Raimondi. She is currently a guest professor for theoretical philosophy at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She works at the intersection of aesthetics, critical social theory, feminism, and political philosophy. In addition to her monograph, The Time of Democracy, she's written articles on a host of topics. So I'll give you a very partial list. I had to stop myself. Habits, affect, avant-garde theater, The Prince, subjectivation, policing, Hoffmann, Nietzsche, Foucault, aesthetic temporality, and ideology. And that's just a very, very brief list of all of the topics that she's explored in her essays. Today, she's going to be giving us a talk on interdependencies, independencies, there's a parentheses around the deconstructing autonomy.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to the organizers for this very interesting conference and for inviting me and giving me opportunity to speak here. So my paper will continue the critical perspective on autonomy, open more closer. So, better, yeah. So I continue on these critical lines that was opened up yesterday by many interventions, and I try to be a bit more pushy in that respect in order to see where and how we have to overcome autonomy and search for a different notion of freedom, but also of independency. And I'm very happy about this invitation because I always had skepticism about autonomy, although this notion sounds so compelling, but never made explicit how different lines of my philosophical inquiries are, in fact, critical interventions against this notion. So I will gather, as you heard, I do a lot of different things. Maybe I'm a bit just not clear about what my interests are, but I will have different fields that I bring together, which makes the topic of the paper a bit sketchy in some parts, but I hope still interesting. And I want to be more pushy because I think the practice and reality of autonomy are far less appealing than its theoretical formulation sounds. So let me depart from the observation that our present time is marked by two extreme and indeed extremist manifestations of autonomy. On the one hand, autocratic figures such as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, alongside with their female equivalents like Giorgia Meloni and Marie Le Pen. On the other hand, a persistent economy of mastery over the natural conditions of human existence, visible not only in the climate crisis, but also in the rising prevalence of burnout and depression as effects of current labor conditions. Although these phenomena might appear to be perversions of autonomy, as we had it yesterday, both sovereignty and mastery can nevertheless be traced as excesses of this modern concept of freedom. And so their occurrence prompts us to ask why autonomy can become so excessive and urgently demands its critical re-examination. Such a re-examination in the light of harmful effects of autonomy, however, is not new. In fact, we can look back to a whole history of critiques of autonomy accompanying the whole development of modernity, as they have been formulated by Hegel, Marx, or Nietzsche, but also by more minoritarian strands of modern thinking, such as feminist or decolonial theory. In what follows, I aim to develop a critical perspective on autonomy with the help of Hegel, Freud, Frantz Fanon, and Elisabeth Povinelli. That's, of course, a lot, and the result will be a bit sketchy, as I said, but I wanted to engage in this overview because these different positions tackle different aspects of the problem, and maybe it's helpful to see them first in a constellation before going deeper into them. Borrowing a term from feminist theory, we might see in these positions successive waves of critiques of autonomy, each wave not only shifting the terrain and uncovering new dimension of its negative entailments, but also confronting increasingly radical problems at the heart of the concept itself. At the same time as the waves, these positions are not fully unrelated to one another, as will become hopefully clearer in my reconstructions, but they shed light on different socio-historical and geopolitical effects of autonomy. As one first common trait I propose to group this position under the broader concept of deconstruction, since I understand them as engaging in a similar, particular mode of immanent critique, each exposing not only internal contradictions, but more importantly, the unthought and thus unlived or mislived preconditions of autonomy. So they show what autonomy does not want to acknowledge and does not want to live. My reading of these lines of thought aims, therefore, I guess, at presenting autonomy, one could say in Marxist terms, as an ideological conception of freedom, an ideal grounded in unacknowledged conditions whose denial or repression necessarily leads to pathological forms in its practical realization. In this sense, one might say the perversions and excesses of autonomy are not a contingent outcome, they show how autonomy looks like in practice. That's a bit strong, but yeah, it's a provocation and I think helpful for discussion. So what is autonomy? The concept of autonomy fundamentally shapes the grammar of Western modernity. It is perhaps the defining category of modernity, driving its project, to borrow Habermas' terms, and constituting the reality of capitalist civil society. Economy, law, politics, art, and philosophy in the West have been largely formed by the idea of autonomy and continue to do so to this day. As Brian yesterday, I also take autonomy to be a key concept of liberal and especially capitalist modernity. Some mentioned yesterday that autonomy was also repeatedly an emancipatory concept, so maybe we should keep it. And I come from Italy, and in Italy the extra-parliamentary workers' movement had the name Autonomia Operaia, so it's very present for my upbringing, so I see that. And also feminist struggles against the subordination of women used repeatedly the notion of autonomy, as you can see, for example, in the work of Simone de Beauvoir. But not all counter-movements of modernity relied on this concept, and this for a reason. Autonomy does not simply signify freedom or emancipation, it represents a particular conception of them. Derived from autos, self, and nomos, law, autonomy refers to a form of freedom grounded in a self-referential and self-aware subject, one that binds itself through this self-relation to a specific kind of norms, namely laws. Terry Pinkard reformulates the Kantian idea of autonomy as arising, I quote, from giving oneself the practical law rather than having it imposed, even partially, from outside, end of quote. Christoph Menke reconstructs autonomy not as an act of legislation, but of expressive self-realization, of following the law that is constitutive for subjectivity. So not a choice, but something we kind of express about ourselves. With or without choice, the concept of autonomy is intrinsically linked to identity. The binding force of autonomous laws or norms stem from the fact that they can be said to be mine or ours. Yet the self that legislates for or acknowledges itself must be a qualified one. Not every assertion of subjectivity is autonomous, only that which arises from reason and insight. Autonomy, then, is a category of identity that simultaneously introduces an internal evaluative distinction within the subject. It grounds on a self-reflective act able to distinguish what is really constitutive for him or herself and what is not. And in Kant, this, at least with respect to moral philosophy, is the distinction between reason on one side and affects and drives on the other. So that's how I take to be like the strict notion of autonomy, the one that we have to fight against. And it is in this specific structure that the successive waves of critique have the successive waves of critique have problematized different aspects of this structure. By reconstructing this powerful notion, they transformed the notion of freedom, but also deepened the awareness of the interdependencies in the sense of the relations and the dependencies in which it is embedded. So I come to my first position, the doubleness of reflection. Although Hegel's position can be read as a rescue of Kantian autonomy by recasting it in terms of social practices or as the life of spirit, as Thomas has brilliantly done in his book, I would propose to see in him a critic of autonomy who precisely by taking the concept profoundly seriously reveals its limitations. Hegel engages with the limitations and critical fault lines of autonomy across various contexts of his time, as a category of enlightenment, in the terror of the French Revolution, and in the egoism, self-sucht of civil society and the system of needs. So these are all, I guess, figures, perversions of autonomy that he has in view. The phenomenology of spirit, which will serve as my point of reference here, repeatedly stages new and repeatedly failing figures of autonomy. The absolute freedom of the French revolutionaries is preceded by a series of earlier figures, beginning with the nascent independence of self-consciousness as self-sufficiency, Selbstständigkeit, and continuing with the stubbornness, Eigensinn, of the bondsman. The recurrent appearance of autonomy in the phenomenology, the fact that it cannot be simply dismissed very quickly, underscores its constitutive significance, both individually and collectively. Autonomy, one could say, is not a contingent form of freedom, but one that arises with a certain necessity from the very structure and unfolding of modern self-consciousness. And only by working through these forms and exposing their inherent one-sidedness does Hegel arrive at a different, more complex conception of freedom. Although self-sufficiency and stubbornness are not fully developed figures of autonomy in the strict sense, they mark crucial moments in Hegel's unfolding critique. What these figures share with this concept of autonomy is their attempt to secure truth or freedom through the affirmation or stabilization of the self against the other. Here first against object, then against other self-conscious beings. And we heard a lot about the competitive nature of autonomy yesterday. This gesture captures the self-referential impulse of autonomy while simultaneously exposing its insufficiency. Self-consciousness must risk its life in order to experience independence and to liberate itself from what Hegel calls its being absorbed in the expanse of life, Versenkung. Yet this experience of freedom is only possible through the relation to another. So the peripateia of autonomy culminates in a relation of recognition, which is not necessarily symmetrical but reciprocal, in which both parties acknowledge one another as mutually recognizing self-consciousnesses. As many of you, we had recognition yesterday. At this point, I think autonomy, understood in its ontological sense, is overcome, as all movements of self-determination are revealed to be not only enabled but mediated by intersubjective relations, to which social and objective relation have to be added, so that would make the argument more full. This is why the proto-figures of autonomy never attain a fully reflective autonomy in the Kantian sense I outlined earlier. Reflexivity, as Hegel arguments suggest, is not, nor can it ever be, a purely subjective capacity or an act performed by an isolated subject. Rather, it is grounded in and constituted by intersubjective and social relations. So these are the substance, the being of a reflexive orientations. This is also why Hegel speaks of a doubled reflection, to indicate that reflection emerges between subjects and not within them alone. Rather than grounding autonomy, reflection itself shows to be enabled by relation that precedes and exceeds the subject. This does not diminish the agency and accountability of the subject, quite to the contrary. Precisely because reflection emerges from and is situated in conditions that are equally constitutive, yet external to the subject responds not only to his own conscience and Gesinnung, but also to its surrounding with its activity. The absoluteness, and the same can be said on a collective level. So I take Hegel not to say, okay, we have to just, attribute autonomy to collectives rather than to individuals, but the same argument would hold also for practices. And in fact, the absoluteness that emerges at the end of the phenomenology has no longer the form of an absolute freedom, but of an absolute knowledge, namely the recognition that freedoms depends on constitutive differences and tension within practices, that it's spread, that it's not centered in some sort of one subject, but in, differences among these practices. While Hegel makes a powerful move to deconstruct the self-referential illusion of autonomy, his account can nonetheless be problematized for offering an overly integrated reconstruction of practices, one in which subjects found themselves already dwelling in and responding to, and this is why, of course, my account cannot end with Hegel. I come to my second position, Freud's psychoanalysis can also be read as a critique of the idea of autonomy, one that, like Hegel's, is grounded in a dynamic and experience-based understanding of both psychic and social life. If Hegel deconstructs the ontological dimension of autonomy, Freud can be seen as challenging its nomological structure by highlighting the role of impulses and pleasures, so the centros level we had already yesterday, and thereby introducing greater disruption in the fabric of social relation and norms, as Hegel does. While Freud may at first seem to advocate a form of individualism compatible with the ideal of autonomy, his work ultimately problematizes the bourgeois culture of autonomy prevalent in his time. Like Hegel, Freud does so by examining the pathologies and forms of suffering, above all neurosis, that this ideal tends to produce. For Freud, neurosis is not a symptom of heteronomy, but rather the result of an excess of self-determination. It arises when the individual internalizes the law-giving authority and becomes the agent of the very norms that were initially imposed from without. As Leo Bersani has shown, this internalization redirects the subject's own aggressiveness, originally provoked by the internal imposition of norms, against the self. The superego is thus not merely the voice of the father or an external authority. It is also, and more crucially, the manifestation of the subject's own aggression turned inward. The sense of guilt Freud diagnoses in modern capitalist culture does not stem from the lack of enjoyment, but from the enjoyment of one's own aggression, and crucially from the pleasure derived from acts of self-control and self-subjugation. So for Freud, the superego is also largely unconscious, and it can derive pleasure from unpleasure, and we had that also already yesterday as a topic. In this sense, neurosis follows the same logic as autonomy. It is an autological act in which one binds oneself to norms and mistakes this very act for freedom. What psychoanalysis reveals is that this structure is inherently unstable. It is, by definition, neurotic. Accordingly, the cure for neurosis does not consist in finally achieving the correct form of autonomy by identifying the right norms, nor, as Jonathan Lear has compellingly argued, does it lie in rational self-reflection. Rather, psychoanalytic practice aims above all at disarming the superego, that is, the excessive enjoyment of self-control that suppresses the subject's dependence on other unconscious and more conflicted pleasures and unruly impulses. If we read Freud through the lens of Judith Butler, autonomy appears as the supposed freedom of a superego that represses its own passionate attachment and the difficult and ambivalent conflicts they provoke. From this perspective, the ethics of psychoanalysis does not aim to replace the id with the ego, but rather to abandon the ideal of self-mastery in favor of a more nuanced relation to the drives, one that learns to face their conflictual nature and pleasures, but also their opacity and ungovernability. This mode does not seek to distance, control, or judge this drive. It does also, but not only. Instead, it begins also to listen and to engage to them and to engage with their strange and unfamiliar voices. In contrast to modern philosophies of the subject, psychoanalysis posits not two but three psychic agencies whose triadic relationship resists the reduction to a simple hierarchy of subordination. I think this is what Schiller starts to do as well. The ethics of psychoanalysis thus reveals psychic life as a field of tension shaped by shifting forms of dependence and independence. So this dependence and independence has different, sides to deal with. Neither the id nor the binding norms of the superego can be regarded as the true locus of freedom, which tellingly is also not a category of psychoanalysis, or an important one. Freedom, or at least non-compulsive psychic life, consists in contrast in constant negotiation among these dimensions, whose differences both require and enable various forms of receptivity rather than granting absolute primacy to norms or impulses. And I thought this idea, I think, is present in Schiller as well, who takes advantage from this tripartite structure. While psychoanalysis more strongly challenges the normative dimension of autonomy than Hegel, it tends to downplay the role of the other, and yet the mediation to the other, at least in a psychoanalytic setting, is crucial. Like Hegel, Freud works through the modern logic of autonomy to uncover its unacknowledged and repressed condition, yet more radically than Hegel, he moves beyond the very notion of freedom by foregrounding the constitutive role or at least its entanglement with dependency, but also with pleasures. So I come to my third position. The relationship between freedom and dependency is also central, namely, to the critiques of autonomy, to which I would like to turn now, critiques powerfully articulated from more marginalized perspective than those of Hegel and of Freud. So perspective, one could say that the autonomous subject has historically cast as its object, its instrument, or as mere bodies or nature. Feminist, post-colonial, and ecological thinkers have launched new waves of critique by uncovering further hidden preconditions of autonomy. More forcefully than Hegel or Freud, this perspective emphasized that the Western idea of the autonomous subject is materially and also symbolically sustained by relations of domination. They have shown how hierarchies based on gender, class, and race, and also species, are not peripheral, but constitutive of the supposedly autonomous life of some. Autonomy is not just self-domination, these strands of critique show, but a form of freedom that constitutively relies on the domination of others. And I thought this both materially as well as symbolically. And this is why the very concept of autonomy has also served as an ideological instrument for legitimizing the structures of domination. So the one that can be attributed autonomy are the good ones, and the others can be enslaved or, I don't know, married. In this sense, these perspectives have exposed harmful dimensions of autonomy that often remain concealed even within the critical discourses of autonomy, and thus provide a significant shift from the critiques already discussed. Frantz Fanon offers, I think, a particularly important example in this regard, especially in Black Skin, White Masks, as his work forcefully underscores also the limitation of both the paradigm of recognition and of psychoanalysis when it comes to understand and advance the colonial struggles. Fanon argues that the colonized subject is stripped of any ontological resistance and thereby excluded even from the possibility of asymmetrical recognition. The colonial relation is at least a vexed form of recognition, that's maybe the better way to pose it, one that simultaneously reveals a peculiar excess of autonomy in which the colonizer positions themselves as sovereign over a disposable and objectified other. So this is, again, so the colonial condition is as such an excess of autonomy in the form of sovereignty. Similarly, also many of the categories and diagnoses of psychoanalysis reveal their Eurocentric foundation, rendering them inadequate for grasping the condition of the colonized. More explicitly than Freud does, the colonial situation requires a sociopathological approach, taking not only the family as the crucial institution for psychic development, but also social conditions and the violent relations internal to them. In engaging with the vexed relation of coloniality and the violence of racism, however, Black Skin, White Masks does also not return to the paradigm of autonomy. The fifth chapter, in which Fanon evokes the experience of racialization from a quasi-phenomenological internal perspective, portrays the impossibility of escaping colonial domination simply by reclaiming one's black identity. So this is why I'm a bit suspicious of autonomy with Fanon as an emancipatory category. The book resists closure. It does not reach a clearly decipherable resolution of the struggle or a new normative orientation for it. Trapped in the violently foreclosed relationship of colonial or misrecognition, Fanon ends the book with a plea that gestures beyond fixed identity. I quote, "Oh, my body, make me always a man who questions," end of quote. Confronted with the impossibility of claiming autonomy on the basis of colonized cultural tradition, Fanon never fully abandons the framework of recognition or psychoanalysis. And yet he operates and has to operate differently within them. So he cannot just use them in the European way. In the limbo of an unfinished liberation, Black Skin, White Masks opens a discourse in which the body and affect assume a central role alongside references to alternative forms of knowledge and poetic language. At the same time, it is a discourse that repeatedly exposes scenes of violence, of suffering, and of discrimination. Fanon's decolonial perspective reveals the complexity and impurity of the struggle for liberation. Rather than seeking a purified self-relation, like completely distancing, the other, his struggle unfolds within the condition of ongoing domination and violence, conditions that are unknown, I would say, for most of theories of autonomy, as their attention is mostly directed inwards to question of self-legislation and self-consciousness. And yet, Fanon opens also to the awareness of a field of forces and impulses that resist this domination, forces that neither fully belong to the registers of self-consciousness nor of that of their cognition, but also are not fully independent of them. So I think here opens up a sort of indecidability where these resisting forces that Fanon repeatedly, endorses and puts forward come. So it's dirty. Yeah, we need all these aspects in order to understand Fanon's position. If in Freud the coexistence of freedom and dependency within psychic life disturbs the autological and nomological structure of autonomy and provides the ground for openness and receptivity, in Fanon this tension becomes social and corporeal and more related to suffering than to pleasure. At the same time, the situation of the colonized lacks the safe space of the therapeutic setting that must instead be negotiated and created within the volatile terrain of historical and embodied structure. So it must create spaces where he can kind of deal with it without having this comfortable couch. Although the book but it makes something that is similar, so that's what I want to say here. Although the book different, but creates these spaces, is able to create these spaces within the struggle of survival, as we might say. Although the book often adopts the form of an inner monologue, opposing at times in vain the racist and colonial interpellation, Fanon also waves in multiple voices through quotation, literary allusion, and theoretical references to shape his intervention, so he's not alone. This polyphony reflects the position he attributes to the colonized subject, caught in a dual and destabilizing relation, exposed on the one hand to a supposedly sovereign other, and on the other to the potential for non-violent, liberating, and also effectively charged encounters with other others than the sovereign ones. This doubleness defies simple classification as either condition of freedom or unfreedom. So it's wrong to say that they are free, but that the colonized subject is free, but it's at the same time also wrong to say that they are unfree. And I think this is what this position causes us to think, this kind of entanglement of the two as the field from which resistance, but often also in the form of mere survival, comes from. By doing that, so by forcing us to think this entanglement, Fanon at the same time also offers a powerful critique of autonomy, both by revealing the colonizer's sovereignty along with the enforced relation of non-relation it imposes as conditions and effects of Western autonomy, and by exposing how this very sovereignty is always already failing. Crucially, it shows how the colonizer's autonomy is dependent materially, psychically, and libidinally on the position and presence of the colonized. So I come to the last figure of my story, Elisabeth Povinelli. I think I still have 10 minutes, no? Yeah, okay. So Elisabeth Povinelli, a US-American anthropologist engaged in the colonial struggles in Northern Australia that contributes to the critique of autonomy by addressing the link between neocolonial sovereignty and extractivism, which she identifies as characteristic of what she terms late capitalism. Povinelli describes late capitalism as a regime in which the economic, political and social structures of a globalized capitalist order can no longer conceal their violent impact on the most visceral dimensions of human existence, such as breeding, on a broad scale. Notably, she made this observation years before the brutal killing of George Floyd and the global COVID-19 crisis, which brought the fragility and politicization of breath sharply into public focus. As early as 2016, Povinelli observed, quote, a potential shift in our political discourses from the demand, listen to me, to the statement, I can't breathe, end of quote. And she interprets this shift as a response not only to anthropogenic climate change, but also to the structural racism and neocolonial legacies embedded in late liberalism. So all those provide a situation, a political situation, whose utterances is, I can't breathe. So it has this kind of urgency. What Povinelli describes can also be understood as a move from the struggle for recognition, listen to me, toward a politics focused on securing shared and equal conditions for coexistence and life itself. This transition departs from an anthropological framework that centers human existence on capacities like speech and labor, as is the fact in Hegel or Marx, and moves toward a perspective that foregrounds also more basic corporeal functions, which are increasingly under threat, such as breathing. So politicizes this kind of lower sensuous dimension of human life. As in anti-racist politics, this shift does not render recognition obsolete. Rather, it introduces additional material dimensions that the intersubjective model of recognition cannot fully capture or does not yet fully capture. In doing so, Povinelli does to the paradigm of recognition what recognition itself did to autonomy. It reveals its underlying condition and recalibrates its meaning. Povinelli seeks to introduce a dimension to the political struggles of the late 20th and early 21st century that remain obscured in the framework, also in the framework like Foucault's concept of biopolitics. Struggles over life and death, particularly in the racialized and gendered forms, are always also struggle over access to and control of inorganic matter and resources. And this dimension, of course, has become increasingly visible in recent years in the politics of Trump or in the wars waged by Putin. So that this struggle of, and it was, however, it was already clearly visible in the history of Western colonization, which was not merely a history of interpersonal domination, but one that linked economic extraction, exploitation, and biopolitical governmentality. Not only in the face of climate catastrophe, therefore, this history that Povinelli tells us compels a deeper ontological reconsideration. Povinelli responds to the entrenched indifference towards non-life, manifest in the extractive logic of colonial and capitalist regime, with a shift in metaphysical orientation. Rather than privileging life and the human and its relations, she insists on acknowledging life's emergence from and entanglement with non-life. I take this not merely as a theoretical complement, but as a demand to foreground the constitutive interrelation between the two, resisting their dualistic separation. Spirit and freedom in this light can no longer be conceived in abstraction from material substrates they presuppose. And the question is how, what does it mean? How does it do it? Does she do it? And she makes a further move in this direction when she asks, where is the human body if it is viewed from the lung, not from its speaking capacity, not from its rational capacities, but from this activity or half activity, such as breathing. A question that reorients our perspective on subjectivity and agency by including also the somatic and the elemental. It invites to consider freedom not solely as something located in the symbolic or intersubjective realm, and also not deriving from the impacts of pleasures and drives, but also as materialized in often neglected vegetative dimensions of embodied life. These dimensions do not only support the realm of freedom, so they're not just preconditions, but they're part of it, as illnesses make us aware. So I think that's what she is trying to do here, so to bring them not as something that, yes, we have to take into account if we want to have freedom somewhere else, but to think again here the entanglement of both. While Hegel and Freud introduce internal differentiations within the living, disrupting the paradigm of autonomy through sociality and the unconscious, Povinelli proposes a further step, a rethinking the entanglement of life and non-life to discern within the subject what it does not fully do and also not just actively embodies. Its vegetative side and entanglement with the organic. And breathing, I think, makes this especially clear, since it is a practice that is never fully within our agency, nor entirely external to it, and yet profoundly influencing our practical and also spiritual existence. And I think I did not have this last part sharp, but maybe you can help me in the discussion to think this entanglement. So I come to conclusion. Since autonomy is the leading notion of modernity and of many of its institutions, a critique of it cannot come from without, but has to start from within, as many of my authors, or all of them, has done. The critique that interests me has the form of a deconstruction because it does not just provide a better notion of autonomy, but shows what autonomy cannot think and live, and why this is harmful and how these neglected elements matter for a full notion of freedom. Intersubjectivity, pleasure, violence, materiality are not relevant aspects for the notion for the freedom of autonomy. At best, they are preconditions or tools or non-ideal conditions of autonomy. So that's how they come into view in a kind of autonomy-centered discourse, but not integral parts of the practice of freedom. To take them seriously as dimensions of freedom, as I tried to do, means to understand freedom not only in terms of choice and decision, but also of listening and understanding. It means to decenter reflection as something that is not made alone, it is not made by a subject, but also in a social condition, but also by other impulses that are present in the subject. So reflection is, with Freud, what could say, also something that is has not just the form of a conscious deliberation, but a complex procedure of coming to terms with different sides and dimensions of the subject that are not equally accessible, so require different forms of susceptibility and receptivity to kind of enter and understand their voices. And freedom, so what they also suggest is to look at freedom not just as a practice of shaping oneself and one's surrounding according to one's own maxims or laws, but as being shaped by them in manifold ways, supportive and harmful one. And especially the last two positions, I think, are pushing very strongly to work on the dichotomy between freedom and necessity as itself one that has taken on the logic of domination. So to separate freedom and necessity has kind of, on-free implication, or it fosters relations of domination. Above all, domination of nature and a domination of those who are assigned to the supposedly purely natural realm. Yeah, and this is why I started my my talk with these two excesses of autonomy, one being the mastery over nature and the other being politics of sovereignty that kind of violently suppress or exclude other groups from the realm of politics. So I think these two last positions I discussed in a way are pushing forward also to provide a problematization of the notion of freedom as such, at least in its being separated from necessity, from dependency, and so on. So thanks for listening.
The queue is open. Sorry. Raise your hand again.
Well, thank you so much for the talk. It's a very interesting one. I would just ask you two things for clarify a little bit your position to see if I'm well understood. First of all, how do you understand, for example, certain ambiguity in the use of a concept of autonomy in Fanon and in the decolonial perspective? Because, well, Fanon has this notion of freedom that is very linked with a certain experience of transcendence, and that is a Sartrean one. That is very connected to this Sartre idea of negative transcendence, and in this way there is a kind of autonomy there. The rest of autonomy that is present in this perspectives, and even in the decolonial thought, we have these notions of autonomous zones.
Yeah.
That it's possible to create a kind of autonomy on the territory. And at the end, when you talk about this author that unfortunately I don't know, and insisting on the possibility of create a kind of entanglement between the organic and non-organic as another type of relationship, relationality. I ask myself if we can also see this in Freud, in the concept of death drive, for example, when there is a kind of a participation between human and non-human in the same structure of behavior, based exactly in this non-distinction between organic and non-organic.
Yeah, thank you very much for both questions. Yes, I mean, I'm trying here to read Fanon, to take him a bit away from this Sartrean. So it's a reading of him, suggesting that in a way, if we look at how black skin, white masks function in the end, so what sort of discourse they try to make, and how he's also distancing himself from Aimé Césaire and other, like decolonial positions, that we can read him there as not embracing autonomy as a emancipatory perspective. But of course, it is present in decolonial struggles. I would say it's not the notion that is that should be embraced. So I'm making a claim there. So I see the presence also. Even the concept of sovereignty is often used in this context, and I don't. I see. I can understand why it's used, but I think Fanon, in a way, in his struggling with, in this continuous, questioning of his position and trying to get rid of the colonial gaze, in a way, acknowledges the fact that he has to work on the relation, so that the struggle for liberation is one that has to be oriented on shifting the relation and not just getting rid of it. And this, I think, it's how I would like to read him. So taking him away from, but of course there can be more Sartrean readings of Fanon. I would not endorse them. And for the second question, yes, that's true. I mean, I think we can read Freud very, very strongly also as being already an author that starts to think of this entanglement with the inorganic within the death, within the death drive. I didn't mention that, but I think that's a line that we can trace back there, although Povinelli herself does not have this kind of reference, but I think this could be worked more out in order to make also, psychoanalysis in this respect interesting for discussions today.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. But if I understand you correctly, I would like to push back on three points. Firstly, for me at least, Kant seems to have a form of relational autonomy or agency. If you look at the Religionsschriften, for example, where he does engage with nature and also with social conditions and especially education, which is very important for him. So that's the first point. And I'm curious what you think about that. The second point pertains also a bit to the previous person. Like in chapter 5 of Fanon, Fanon discusses, I think first, why Aimé Césaire and claiming the black identity is problematic in itself, because it also, in a Sartrean way again, fixes an identity of being black. Yeah. And then he criticizes Sartre for saying, okay, but don't put this now in a kind of broader dialectic of the emancipation of the proletariat. And then his position, as I understood it, was, let us just be and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And then I think, for me at least, in chapter 7, he talks about the violence, which is, I think, the famous chapter 7b, where I always understood it that, okay, he said, thank you for your recognition as persons within the current system of law, the current normative order, which happened without the struggle. But I always had the idea that he wanted to go into the struggle to create their own social space that they can recognize themselves in, which at least, again, seems to me that there is some kind of idea of autonomy there, where he says we need to have the conditions or the preconditions to be autonomous in the first place. And that brings me to my third point, and also what I brought back home from yesterday. I always had the idea that autonomy can be used and misused, and I think if you can use it as a critical concept to claim, or there are also marginalized groups and also other groups claim for different kind of preconditions that can, I mean, education, healthcare, and all these kinds of things, that from where we can be autonomous and actually somehow, maybe the concept of law is a bit problematic, depends how you understand it, but somehow where we can posit ourselves and a kind of have this Selbstbestimmung, I think it's better than, for example, and I'm interested in your thought about this, than the concept of social justice that's used a lot, especially in post-colonial theory, which I find sometimes problematic. At least I don't really know what they mean with it, but they claim for social justice. But I have the idea always that it implies already a form of institutions and a form of justice. And to go back again to Fanon, isn't that the whole point, to have our own form of justice and our own form of institutions? So thank you. Sorry for the long talk.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks for pushing back, because of course I wonder if I do justice to the, if I have the full picture of autonomy. And what I think, I mean, of course, in Kant there are a lot of interesting sides, but as I try to make sense of what he does, it seems to me they are important, but they are corollary. You know, they're not in the center of where we play autonomy and how, or freedom. You know, this is purely understood as a self-referential process of asking myself, are these the right maxims in the face of a law? And then all these other things come also into view, but they are not intrinsic to the very moment where freedom, or in terms of autonomy, is assessed or not. And this I find problematic. So he talks about a lot of things, but he does not talk about them in his moral philosophy. So they come, you know, in other contexts. And I think this seems to me a too weak connection between the way he understands freedoms in terms of autonomy, and he brings all these other matters and things into view. So, and that's what I want to say. So it's not that deliberating, reflecting, or doing a lot of things that Kant describes is, we should not do that, but we should understand how these activities are embedded in conditions, how their very nature is not. So I think Kant has how to say, myope, is short-sighted. You know, like he kind of has a has not a sharp view on what how these other elements and dimensions matter for the very practice of freedom. And this is this is my problem with the notion of autonomy. That might not be sufficient for you, but yeah, it's good to, we will continue that conversation. The second question you had about Fanon. Yeah, I mean, it resonates with the first question I got, that I would try to see him as someone who's not fully, so he's this quarreling with Sartre on the one side and Césaire on the other, as you rephrase it, is kind of rejecting a form of négritude, of kind of closing up in a black identity that he sees it's not available anymore. You know, like we are in this colonial entanglement, so we cannot go back there. He tries, you know, in this chapter 5, he continuously tries to read history, to read literature, to kind of gain from there a sort of stable form of self-relation, but he fails. And on the other side, against Sartre, he says, okay, but the colonial struggle has a specificity, so we cannot subsume it under the struggle of the proletariat. So we have to understand its specificity, so we have to acknowledge it, but without enclosing it in a kind of specific and totally unrelated struggle with respect to others. That's how I would read him. And the last chapter is very, I think it's very difficult to decipher what he does there. So I think you have a much more kind of try to point him there down to claiming some sort of autonomy and independency from the colonial relation. I think this is something that the question of violence will become more important than in the later writings. But I find this last chapter interesting because he's precisely operating, so he's still within the question of how do I change and intervene in the violent relation of coloniality, one that I cannot just leave, you know, like I have to dwell in it, I have to fight in it, and I cannot just turn my back to it and just do, you know, my little autonomous practice, because that's not an available option. So and the need to kind of have an encounter there with the other, that's what he says in the last parts, you know, why can we not kind of just touch each other, you know, like he's still sticking at the relational, at working on the relation, also on the violent relation, and not just, you know, enclosing itself within the group of those that are not violently colonizing. And I think this is a poetical, so it's not resolved. It's not, you know, it's unideal, but that's where he has to bring forward his struggle. That's how I would try to read him. So I don't read him as an autonomy thinker of decolonial struggles. And this I derive from his distancing from Césaire. And the last question, which is related to this one about the critical use of autonomy, I would say, yes, of course, I see that there is critical uses of it. I don't think it's politically helpful to do so. So, and you should tell me why social justice is not interesting to you, because I think this is a political orientation that is precisely going to reorganize the relation among all the groups involved and kind of causing the violent relations, right? So, and autonomy is again like a form of wanting to stop the fight, which is anyways not, in a globalized world, not possible. So the quest for social justice is a quest of reshaping social relations in a broader sense. And that's why I find it interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very thought-inspiring talk. I'm particularly interested in the concept of freedom that you proposed in the very end as a conclusion to your critique of autonomy. The way I understood it is that you want the concept of freedom that does not make the mistake to consider all kind of preconditions of our life and our social life and our psychical life as a mere limit or a means or a precondition of freedom, but as an essential part of freedom, to kind of enrich the concept of freedom we have through all of those dimensions you were talking about. So the question I have is, what happens to experiences where I experience these kind of preconditions as in fact as kind of a limitation? Like, for example, if I have asthma and my lung is not working and I can't make it up the stairs, or I can't do what I want to do because I'm sick, then I would, my first intuition would be to say, well, that's actually a moment of unfreedom. My lung is limiting my unfreedom. But when I promote the concept of like a freedom that like wants to see, for example, the lung as an essential part of my freedom, what happens to this kind of experiences? And also, like, you know, it's not that you want to say, well, the lung is a means for freedom. It can work, it cannot work. If it works, you are free. If it doesn't work, you're not free. But like, you don't want this moment of like to see it as a means, but as an essential part of freedom. But then my question is, what happens to the experience of unfreedom in relation to the preconditions of our existence?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, I do not want to say that having asthma is also freedom. That's not, it's not the case. So it's not that experiences of unfreedom are excluded and that everything becomes part of it. I just want to say that this kind of more bodily dimension is, so as you say, we experience it as on freedom. So it's not just a precondition. It itself matters for the question of freedom and the capacity we have to kind of live with it. And so that's the field we have to dwell. And I think this is lacking, I think, in a merely rational and kind of reason-oriented understanding of freedom. So I don't want to recode them. I don't want to say, okay, they're good or so. But I want to bring them in as something that is not just, you know, around it, but it matters centrally. And of course, I mean, if we have bodily conditions, that of course will impact our, makes us our practice less free. But that's where we have to, where we play. You know, our quest for freedom is not just before, but that's the non-ideal condition where we have to be. And I think this is what both Povinelli and maybe stronger even Fanon and part of the colonial thinking is highlighting, that they put the emphasis on, I mean, in their case, it's of course dealing with very violent condition, but they highlight this aspect of surviving, of, you know, like living with very non-ideal, very harmed condition as something that we have to see in terms of freedom, although it does not look like that. So kind of dealing with this condition, how we do it, we just don't neglect them and still try to go up the stairs as if it was nothing, you know, like, but we in a way recalibrate our own practice in the light of these aspects and maybe deal with them in a different way. They're not just annoying, but we have to see what's going on there. What does it make to me, and so on and so forth. So this is bringing a bit the perspective on this very pure orientation to freedom as the thing that we have to just look at the more, all the other conditions in which we act. And I think autonomy is therefore sounds good because it looks always only at the side of how I can make myself free from these conditions. Yes, I have asthma, but I still kind of deliberate freely about things, you know. And I would like to bring the asthma in, and not saying it's beautiful and good, we all have to have asthma, but we all have similar, you know, kind of limitations in different ways that are a substantial part of how we learn and deal with freedom.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for this very interesting talk. I was maybe I'm continuing somehow the question that David just raised, because I was wondering whether you think that these four positions have different ideas of what we lose or what is at stake when we kick autonomy out of the picture. Like, maybe for Hegel, as you presented him, you could say it's losing contact with others or with myself. For some, maybe it's like being able to realize myself. So it's, as I think you said, we have four different kinds of critique of autonomy, and I was wondering, is it also four different kinds of idea of what is actually at stake if we lose autonomy? So are there different things that are linked to the idea of autonomy in the sense of what is at risk, or why shouldn't we just leave it out? What is it that, what is the work that autonomy still has to do in their concepts? I don't know if I'm...
Yeah, no, I understand. No, actually, I wanted to say with the four of them that is this working through autonomy. So they all engage with kind of forms of autonomy that they all addressed in terms of very problematic outcomes of their own society, and they are very different. So they all deal with very different phenomena that they, however, I think link to autonomy and to kind of an understanding of freedom in terms of autonomy that they see as limited. But the fact that they work through these problems means that they also take autonomy serious. So it's not just it's contingently there, but we have to kind of understand it, but also overcome, so pass through it to see what autonomy does not see. And then we get a fuller picture where elements that are kind of put in the front by the notion of freedom that identifies freedom with autonomy look differently. So it's not that we stop to reflect. That's what but what reflecting means is something quite different if we get the full picture. So they don't give up, I would say, everything of autonomy. They retain things of it, but they reformulate it differently, and that in that sense leave the ground of autonomy, but they don't get rid of everything. So that's what I wanted to say. But I would say they make the move of saying, okay, if we work in this way through autonomy, we don't lose anything, we gain. So we gain a fuller picture of what is at stake if we talk about freedom, and also parts that maybe we don't want to talk in the discourse of autonomy, but it's still that make the thing a bit maybe less ideal as the autonomy discourse thinks, and more related, more complicated, also more. That's where I come a bit. Have the limits of how I can formulate it, not these entanglements, and so I understand your questions in a way, but they don't fully give up, so they don't go next to it, so they don't leave the terrain of autonomy, but they transform it heavily, and so they retain something of it as well, but differently. That's how I wanted to phrase it.
Thank you so much, Francesca. It was really great. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the relation between the notions of agency and autonomy? Because I think that one of the problems is that we think of agency always as a sort of transparent, autonomous action and so on. And in this way, we don't recognize other forms of agency with them we are entangled in this sense. So I wanted to ask you if you think that these two notions are a sort of equivalence, agency and autonomy, or if there are a possible difference, and I hope this is the second.
Yeah, it's very much the second. I think all the positions, in a way, that I sketched out make are comments to that question. So are try to situate agency differently and also really change. I mean, the last part on breathing, of course, we can say, yeah, it's an action, but it's also not. And if we see that as mattering for within the question of, in that case, human agency, we are immediately also oriented towards looking at other forms of agency and of impacts and of even the elements, like air, and as, in a way, being connected to the question of agency, and so revaluing and recognizing them. And I think this is what this view is what autonomy blocks, because so in that sense, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your fascinating talk. It's really thought-provoking. I have to think about a lot. But my question is kind of in the direction that David's question was. And I was wondering what concept of freedom we have after going through the deconstruction of autonomy. And now in your response, I got that the idea is that we, through the deconstruction, we can realize what autonomy does not see. And so is there the idea that we have to get a bodily dimension into an account of freedom that is not just a prerequisite, but a condition within the concept of freedom itself? And is the idea of freedom then still kind of a concept of self-determination in a maybe socially and bodily related way? And I would be interesting because I think it's really interesting, and I think I haven't understood it fully, the idea what it means that life is coming from non-life and how that works. And because you said the question is how the human body, how we can get the human body into view maybe from the perspective of the lung and not from speech or other dimensions. And I would be really interested if you can say something more about this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I would say, as how I was trying to make sense of what I'm saying, in the end, I would say that bringing all these other elements and aspects into view that, in a way, autonomy does not see or does not want to see, means to enlarge the practice of freedom in its dependencies also further, so not to identify it with self-determination. So there is self-determination, of course it cannot, but that's not the center, that's not the only mode in which freedom is acted out. So it's just one, and I think autonomy really gives all in on self-determination, and that makes sense, but we have to kind of enlarge the picture, and then we see all other sorts of practices that are also, they're less active, less determining, but they are all listening, kind of trying to make sense of my pleasures or unpleasures that don't have the form of self-determination, and even dealing with this kind of vegetative dimensions of the body and seeing what's going on there. Are not things I can fully self-determine. But if we look at breath and how it's shaped by environmental, social, by labor conditions and so on, we see to put the perspective there to look at it. So we have to suddenly look at activities that are very different from just rational reflection or determination, and but still can be shaped. So there is a lot of things to say and to uncover there also socially. You know, how does our society look like if we read her from the capacity of the possibility of breathing? You know, it tells us a lot about racism, about working conditions, and so on. So in that sense, it's a bit decentering the notion of freedom from the notion of self-determination without fully putting it aside, but also understanding slightly different how it comes about. So what is all necessary to be able in some senses to do self-determination, but not to just value this practice as the best one. You know, we heard also yesterday a lot about from Brian's talk, I think, how there is a one-sided valuation of this kind of very active, very kind of normatively reacting on oneself and shaping oneself and so on and so forth. And the second part of your question, so I think I'm still very busy to understand what she wants to say to us. So what is this movement of thinking that life is coming from non-life? And of course, in a way, it's banal. We all know it, you know, like read Hegel. But sorry. No, but in a way, I think she's trying to make this connection differently. So it's, of course, in a sense, also that is a connection that we don't leave back. So it's not that at some point life comes onto Earth and then we have different practices and then we can think about them, but to think how they are constantly entangled and to shift the perspective, not because normally we look, okay, we have life and then we see how life is needs non-life, needs inorganic matters of different sorts to shelter, to eat, to eat is of course also organic, but let's say material things. And if she switches so I don't really have an answer to your question. I'm kind of intrigued by her shifting perspective. So to look from the inorganic to the organic. So to kind of mirror us, to look at us from a perspective that is not the usual one, and to see how here we have a connection that is constantly in place. So if we breathe, if we do other things, we are constantly producing life from non-life at the same time. And thinking of non-life or kind of the elements means thinking a dimension of the living that has at the same time brings a very strong moment of sharedness, of commonness. So the elements are in a way, shared in a very different way as other dimension of the non-organic. And I think that's also something that is in here as a communal dimension. But yeah, so I'm blubbering to say I don't have a real question, but I think it's interesting to think.
We've got 2 minutes left and 3 questions, so maybe we'll gather them.
Cluster them in, yeah. Okay, thank you for the rich talk. I really like the way you describe the Freud part, that the task is to disarm the superego and develop a more nuanced relation to the drives. But then I was hesitant when you said that's a critique of the nomological structure of autonomy. I get the idea that Hegel is criticizing the autological and then Freud in some sense the nomological, but I was wondering if we completely reject the structure of law, if this is not also if this could not also have effects or pathologies of a different kind. So, for example, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, this foreclosure would result in psychosis. And I was wondering if these drives that we want to get in touch more if they are not informed with certain laws, and if there's not more a dialectic relationship between law and desire. So I was not sure if if what you described is a critique of the nomological dimension, but more of the auto-nomological dimension. So just the question if there's a heteronomy that could be productive, going back to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for the question. No, then I didn't make myself clear. So by saying that he's rejecting the nomological aspect, is that he rejects to think that freedom is only to be had with relation to, so it's only played within the relation to the norms, but it needs to be played out with the other side too, and these sides are related to each other. So it's not that the drives are fully independent of the normative, but still they have a different, so I refer to them in a different modality, and precisely the fact that they are connected to each other, so that this structure is still, like the superego and the id are, like they are all part of the same structure, but they function differently. So to say that he rejects the nomological side doesn't mean that he rejects norms, but it just rejects the idea that freedom is only within the, Auseinandersetzung with norms. It is gained by the Auseinandersetzung with also other impulses, pleasures that as such do not have a normative, so they do not have the structure of laws, right? But they are informed, of course, by laws. And the fact that we are, that's also the Schiller idea, the fact that we are determined or kind of made by both brings in distance from both sides, but brings also the possibility to look at norms from the perspective of pleasure, but also to the perspective of pleasure from norms, and say, this is very shitty. I mean, if I enjoy this, then, wow. Yeah? So in that sense, I don't think we lose one side. It's just to play all the question on the normative side. So that's what I wanted to say. No, I didn't have to respond. Sorry.
Thank you, Francesca. I'm pretty much on board when it comes to this idea of stressing the body, when it comes to this attempt to rethink recognition, especially the body as a side of the longue durée of colonial and patriarchal violence, and not so much at the side of desire. This entanglement is interesting, but I like to cycle this back to this notion of reconciliation that I find in Hegel, which is to say we need to find a way of negating the negation that we find in violence, and this idea of, I think, reconciliation as part and parcel of what it means to recognize each other, and that would be something I would really like to hear a bit more on. If that notion that you have of, let's say, the body dimension would allow for any practices of dealing with the wrongness of the past, which goes beyond fixing or undoing the past, but staying with that trouble. That might be one phrase that I find helpful here.
No.
Another question to add to that. I'm still not clear whether I understand the kind of critique you want. So, and just want to invite you to position yourself. So, you were describing it in the end as a form of deconstruction. And I thought during the talk, I had more of the impression it's more like a destruction in the Heideggerian sense. So you want to destroy the idea to clear the way to do something else. Deconstruction, I think deconstruction fits the sense that you used of bringing in further conditions that complicate our picture nicely in a certain sense. But in deconstruction, so if you have, for example, reveal a certain condition of possibility to be the condition of impossibility, it's not meant as a disastrous statement, as a reductio, so the concept is to be thrown away, but this is how it is. It is like, it has a complicated conditional structure, and therefore we are torn in a certain manner and have to find a different way of relating to it. But I think that the kind of, so at least it seems to me that you do not just want an enriched picture of the conditions of autonomy, but you want to decenter the whole notion. So that, like you said in response to one question before, so that's what was another way I wanted to ask the question. So is there something left of autonomy and the core notion of, let's say, self-determination? I mean, it's not self-legislation the way Freud and Hegel see it. It's not individualistic. It's more social and so on. But it's still a form in which self-determination can take place. But you were also responding then in this way, well, it's still part of it, but doesn't have to be, it's to be dissented. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me it's more like you want to clear the way to have, but then what we would be looking for is some new notion of freedom, some other gloss of what freedom basically is. And so maybe you're undecided, that could be as well. But so I wasn't clear. So it seemed to me you have to decide a little bit. Is it a destruction or is it a deconstruction of autonomy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, both questions.
So I think we're sufficiently over time.
Okay, I cannot answer. So
okay.
No, I mean, I mean, I think both are just. I have to think more, so it will not be a very short answer. But I think destruction, I think it's in a way both, because there's still some sort of traces of. First, we can come to this view only by going through autonomy, so we cannot get rid of it. And I also see, I mean, moments of deconstruction are not just keeping the initial concept stable as it was, but by showing the conditions, somehow something shifts in the very way we understand it. So in that sense, and I maybe push this aspect further than as you reconstructed yet now the movement of deconstruction. So it's kind of, yes, there is some traits of autonomy, but it's as if this thing is kind of dissolved and it gets a different shape, you know, if we take these conditions out. So it's not fully lost, but it's also not just retained in this very kind of stable sense as one concept as I have, but I definitely need some sort of different gloss for where I'm getting to. So that's still on its way, yes. And to the reconciliation, I'm not so sure if I would call it reconciliation, but I think yes. I mean, to work through this. So this, I think, very much think that this bodily dimension is a field of kind of coming to terms and negotiating with this violent past, that at the same time, precisely because it is as it is, cannot fully get rid of it, but can at the same time work these layers of violence, try to change them, but it cannot fully leave them away. This is why I think, yeah, staying with the trouble is a good notion of it, and I'm not sure if reconciliation is the same as staying with the trouble. I mean, yeah, if you, yeah, it sounds more kind of positive, yeah. Yeah. But thank you very much all for the questions.